When I think back on it now, it still amazes me how something as stupid as a missing carton of eggs could spark the unraveling of a relationship that had already been rotting from the inside out for months, maybe even the whole year we lived together. Though I didn't want to see it at first because when Valerie moved in, she wasn't the entitled, lazy woman she turned into, but someone who had seemed driven, funny, independent, with her own spark. And I thought I had found a partner, not a dependent. But like a slow leak in the foundation of a house, the cracks widened until one day the whole structure gave way. I'm David. I run a small construction company, and I've always been the kind of man who believes in working hard, providing, taking care of my home. Maybe it's how I was raised, maybe it's just in my wiring. But when she moved in, I made it clear from day one that I'd cover the rent, the utilities, the car payment, all of it, so long as she handled the domestic side. Groceries, cleaning, cooking now and then, just making sure that the apartment we shared actually felt like a home, not just a crash pad. She agreed to this arrangement enthusiastically. In fact, she said she liked the idea of what she called a modern traditionalist setup. But as I later learned, her version of modern traditionalist meant I did everything and she did nothing. And her words about independence and feminism were less about true equality and more about avoiding any responsibility while still taking full advantage of my paycheck. I overlooked the warning signs at first, the empty fridge when I got home from a 10-hour day, the piles of laundry left on the couch while she scrolled Instagram, the endless excuses about how she was in some creative flow state for her graphic design projects, which, if you peeked over her shoulder, looked a hell of a lot like online shopping or mood boarding for a lifestyle she wanted me to bankroll. She had a favorite phrase she threw at me whenever I tried to bring up the imbalance. "I'm not your 1950s housewife." And she'd say it with this patronizing sneer, like I was some backward caveman for wanting her to do the one thing she had agreed to when she moved in. And maybe I should have walked away sooner, but I kept clinging to the memory of the Valerie I met at the start, the witty, ambitious girl who had her own drive. And I convinced myself the entitled version was just a phase. I told myself relationships go through cycles, that she'd bounce back, that my job was to be patient. I was wrong. The breaking point came on a Wednesday after a brutal day at the job site. I came home coated in dust and sweat, running on fumes, just dreaming of dinner and a cold beer. I opened the fridge and what I found was a wasteland, a half-empty ketchup bottle, a shriveled lime, and a sad splash of almond milk rattling in the bottom of the carton. The cabinets weren't any better, just stale chips and a couple of cans of beans. And there she was in the living room, sitting cross-legged with her laptop, claiming to be working on a passion project, but clearly just browsing clothes online. I said, "Hey, there's no food in the house." And she didn't even look up, just muttered something about how she'd meant to go shopping but got into a creative flow state, like I was supposed to nod in understanding while my stomach growled after a 60-hour work week. I reminded her I'd transferred the grocery money to her account on Monday, like I always did, and it was now Wednesday and we had nothing. My patience was fraying, but I tried to keep my voice steady when I told her the one thing I needed, the one thing I asked, was to come home to a stocked fridge and a hot meal every now and then, because I couldn't keep breaking my back all week only to come home to an empty house. That's when she finally looked up from her laptop, her eyes narrowing with that familiar disdain, and scoffed. "Wow, I'm not your housewife, David. I have my own life, my own ambitions. I'm not here to cook and clean for you." And I snapped back that no one was asking her to be a housewife, that we had a deal. My money keeps the roof over our heads. Her effort keeps the house running. That's teamwork. That's partnership. And then she stood up, hands on her hips, and delivered the line that detonated everything we had left. "Oh, I'm sorry. Is providing for your girlfriend too much for you? Be a man, David. That's your job, not mine." The world went quiet in that moment. It was like the constant noise of all our fights, all her excuses, all my hopes just switched off, and the clarity was brutal. She didn't see me as a partner. She saw me as a paycheck with a pulse, a function, a walking ATM whose only duty was to fund her lifestyle while she played at independence. And instead of yelling or arguing, I felt this eerie calm come over me, like a switch had flipped, and I just nodded. "You're right," I said softly. "My mistake." And then I walked into the bedroom, shut the door, and let her bask in what she thought was a victory, smug and triumphant, certain she had put me back in my place. What she didn't know was that in that moment, her words had freed me, because if my job was to provide, then I was going to provide, in the most literal, ironclad, unbreakable sense of the word. I was about to redefine what providing meant, and she wasn't going to like the lesson. That was the night I decided to turn her contempt into the foundation of her education, a course in responsibility, with tuition she'd pay in full. And the next morning, while she still sat oblivious in her little bubble, I began planning the kind of revenge you don't scream about, you don't post about. You build it quietly, brick by brick, until the whole structure comes crashing down on the one person who thought they were untouchable.
When I woke up the next morning, I didn't go to a job site. I went to the hardware store, which felt right, in a way I hadn't expected. I build and fix things for a living, and for months I've been fixing the roof over us while she treated the inside like a suggestion. So I bought a heavy-duty keyed padlock, new locks for every cabinet door, and a bunch of stainless steel hasps, things that would look ridiculous on a sitcom kitchen and incredibly practical in real life. And yes, I spent maybe $200 and didn't flinch, because for the first time in a long while, I was acting in a way that matched my voice instead of mashing down my irritation until it went septic. After that, I went on a grocery run that felt almost celebratory, because I wasn't doing it for her. I was doing it to create a statement. Thick-cut ribeyes, fresh salmon, heirloom tomatoes, artisan cheeses, olives, the good pasta, the kind of food you only buy when you're treating yourself, plus a ridiculous bottle of 25 years single malt scotch I'd been saving for something that actually mattered, and 2 overflowing carts later, I checked out feeling like a man rediscovering his appetite for dignity. Back home, I installed the hardware in less than an hour. The fridge had a steel hasp bolted to the side with a padlock that looked like it belonged on a tool chest, and every cabinet, pantry door, and drawer got its own lock and key. Only one set of keys existed, clinking in my pocket like a small, private jury. And then I stocked everything carefully, like a museum curator arranging priceless objects, lining the shelves in a way that made the kitchen look like a gourmet market. I left the counters immaculate, wiped the handles so they gleamed, and for the first time in months, I felt a small guilty surge of pleasure at how good it all looked. I didn't stick around to watch her reaction. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a budget, line item after line item: rent, utilities, insurance, car payment, groceries, Netflix, Hulu, gym membership, all the little subscriptions she liked to mooch on, every expense that kept her comfortable, tallied up neat and merciless in neat columns. And next to the total, I wrote her contribution: 0. I left the budget on the table like an invoice from reality and took my keys and left the apartment, going to the workshop to do real work, actual labor for a living, which felt cathartic after months of unpaid domestic labor. And when I came back later that evening, I found Valerie and her 2 friends, Qley and Jessica, in the living room like a Greek chorus, faces already twisted into the practiced outrage of people who've rehearsed victimhood. She screeched and accused me of abuse the moment I walked in, as if a new lock on a fridge equaled domestic terrorism. And I listened without raising my voice because, at that point, I had no desire to feed the narrative she'd already decided to publish to whichever follower base would lap it up. I picked up the budget and set it on the coffee table and watched their expressions change from moral outrage to dawning comprehension, then to panic, and I felt a cold satisfaction as they struggled to imagine the math that makes a life. Valerie demanded to know what I'd done with her food, as if entitlement gave her a legal right to my assets. And I unlocked one cabinet, took out a package of ground sirloin and a box of pasta, and told her in the calmest voice I'd used in months that the food in the locked cabinets and fridge was my provision, the literal fulfillment of the job she had insisted was mine. And if being a man meant I had to provide, then I had provided for myself. Her friends launched into the predictable chorus about misogyny and control, and I let them. They were loud, performative, and entirely predictable. But when Valerie went to Instagram the next day, posting a black and white story with a dramatic caption about being locked out of her own home, I didn't flinch. She thought the court of public opinion would judge me because she'd learned to weaponize her vulnerability for likes. But my life isn't lived on a feed, and the people I actually meet in the course of building things with my hands aren't moved by performative outrage. They're moved by competence, by fairness, and by the simple arithmetic of who pays for what. While she fumed and planned her social media campaign, I made more moves that were meticulous, legal, and painfully practical. I took her car keys, the lease was in my name, the card attached to the account listed me as primary, and I towed the car to a secure unit I owned, calling the leasing company to inform them I had revoked her authorization to drive. I canceled the supplementary credit card she'd been using as if it were an entitlement. I closed the streaming profile she had piggybacked on and changed passwords so she couldn't freeload off my digital accounts. I even called the premium gym I'd been paying for and canceled her membership, not out of spite, but to make the point that freeloading has consequences. Each action was a cold, clinical undoing of a life built on someone else's paycheck. Each step was reversible, legal, and utterly devastating to the comfortable illusion she'd been living. Her followers screamed online, and her friends went ballistic. Qley called me every name in the book. Jessica threatened to get the law involved, and Valerie alternated between tears and rage. But when the crying turned to practical problems, no car, no credit card, no gym, no streaming service, the shrieks of moral outrage faded into bargaining and then stone-cold reality. She needed a plan. And for the first time in months, the plan didn't involve verbal gymnastics or performative victimhood. They tried to pick the locks I'd installed. They tried bobby pins and crude tools until they realized how laughably unprepared they were for consequences. But the padlocks held. They called friends who were suddenly unavailable. They posted stories which got a handful of sympathetic comments and a lot of side-eye. They raged and flailed, but in the face of meticulously executed logistics, my spectacle of indignation looked flimsy. Throughout it all, I kept a steady rhythm. Work, come home, cook my own meals from the pantry I'd stocked, and maintain a silence that was louder than any argument. The kitchen smelled like grilled steak and victory, and the quiet, more than anything, was the punishment. I let her scream into the void that now separated us while I rebuilt the small sanctuaries of my life. Then came the final necessary legal step, an eviction notice drafted by my lawyer and served by a process server, crisp and formal, giving her 30 days to vacate. It was humiliating for her in that performative way she hated, served in front of the friends who had championed her on social media, but it was also honest, the end of a relationship where one person had been treated like an expense instead of a partner. She moved out at the end of those 30 days with a duffel of designer clothes and a new, painfully practical education about responsibility. And I sat in the apartment after she left and realized that revenge had never been about cruelty for cruelty's sake. It had been about reclaiming dignity and setting boundaries I should have set long before.
The real escalation came after that first wave of padlocks and budgets, because while Valerie thought she could scream and Instagram her way into painting me as some cartoon villain, I was operating in a world far more tangible than hashtags and sympathy emojis, and in that world, she had no footing. The next morning, while she slept off a long night of raging with her girlfriends, I quietly picked up her car keys from the bowl near the door, drove her leased SUV out to a secure storage unit I owned across town, and shut the door on it like a coffin. Because the truth was simple. The lease was in my name. I was the primary account holder, and she was nothing more than an authorized driver. And authorized drivers can be revoked at any time. So I called the leasing company on my way back and explained the situation, that the vehicle was secured, the relationship had ended, and they should prepare for a return. One more thread in her web of illusions snipped clean. By the time she woke up near noon, her car was gone, and all that remained on the kitchen table was a polite note written in my neatest script. As we are no longer in a relationship, I have taken the liberty of returning the vehicle leased in my name. Please arrange for your own transportation. Best, David. That one sheet of paper sent her into a tailspin, screaming, crying, demanding to know what I had done with her car, calling her friends in a fury, stomping around the apartment like a caged animal. And while she was unraveling in front of her little support squad, I was just getting started. I canceled the supplementary credit card she'd been using to buy clothes and gadgets, shut down her access to the Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon accounts she thought of as basic human rights, and even called the luxury gym she loved to pose at more than actually use, explaining that I was the payer and the relationship had ended, so her membership should be terminated immediately. Every single stroke of the pen, every click of cancel, was like chiseling her free ride into rubble, and it wasn't out of spite. It was about removing every financial artery she'd been siphoning off me without a thought. When she realized the full extent, car gone, cards dead, passwords changed, gym locked, she gathered Qley and Jessica for another dramatic performance in the living room, surrounded this time by takeout sushi that, ironically, had to be charged to one of their cards because hers no longer worked. I came home that night, set my work bag down, unlocked the kitchen that might as well have been Fort Knox to her, and pulled out a thick ribeye, potatoes, asparagus, grilled them on the balcony with a calm she couldn't touch, while the three of them sat in the living room, glaring, whispering, occasionally shouting, their stomachs twisting with hunger and fury as the smell of butter-seared steak filled the air. And then, when they thought it couldn't get worse, a process server knocked on the door the very next day, crisp legal papers in hand, and served Valerie an official 30-day notice to vacate, drafted by my lawyer to be airtight. She looked humiliated as Qley and Jessica looked on, eyes wide, because all their talk of toxic masculinity and financial abuse couldn't erase the fact that legally she had no leg to stand on. The lease was mine, the furniture was mine, the receipts were mine, and all she had was a cat, a duffel of designer clothes, and an endless supply of outrage. Those 30 days became an education she couldn't spin for Instagram. No car meant begging rides from friends until they grew tired of chauffeuring her. No money meant selling her designer handbags on resale apps just to afford basic groceries. And no home meant bargaining with her parents to move back into the childhood bedroom she had once scorned. Her friends, who had cheered her on in performative outrage, suddenly found reasons why she couldn't stay with them. Qley had allergies, Jessica's place was too small, and slowly, painfully, the walls closed in. She cried, she screamed, she tried to argue, but there was no reversing the locks on the cabinets, no restoring the SUV to the driveway, no undoing the cancellation notices. It was like watching someone flail in quicksand, realizing too late that the ground she thought was solid was only stable because someone else had poured the concrete, paid for the gravel, laid the foundation. The countdown to eviction ticked like a metronome, and by the end of it she was packing boxes into her parents' car, throwing glares over her shoulder as if her hatred could dent the calm expression on my face. For me, it wasn't about the theatrics. It was about finally living in a home that wasn't weighed down by resentment, hypocrisy, and the suffocating sense that I was both provider and servant in one body. For her, it was the start of a new life she never wanted. No glamour, no free ride, no curated Instagram stories to prove how enviable her existence was. Just the stark reality of a woman forced to be as independent as she always claimed to be.
It's been a year since that eviction notice ticked down to 0, and in the silence of my apartment now, I can measure the distance between who I was then and who I am now. Because back then, I was a man carrying the weight of someone else's irresponsibility on my shoulders, convincing myself that patience was virtue, when in reality it was denial. And today, I live in a space that is mine alone. Quiet, clean, stocked with the food I buy and cook, decorated with the art I actually care about, and untouched by the kind of hypocrisy that used to seep into every conversation like mold. Valerie's exit was messy. She left the apartment in shambles, tried to fight me over furniture she never bought, but receipts shut that argument down before it began. And by the end, she slunk out with boxes and bitterness, and all I felt was relief. Since then, I've heard enough through the grapevine to know how her life turned out, not because I seek her out, but because circles overlap and stories travel. She moved back in with her parents, which was humiliating enough for her, and they made it clear that this wasn't a free ride. She had to get a real job, pay them rent, contribute for once in her life. She ended up working as a barista at a coffee shop, a job she despises but can't afford to quit, because for the first time in her adult life, she's had to face the cost of independence without a sponsor footing the bills.
The designer handbags, the curated outfits, the influencer poses she used to post about, all gone. Sold off piece by piece on resale apps to scrape together deposits for a shared apartment she eventually found with 2 roommates. The girl who once sneered at me for daring to expect teamwork in a relationship now splits utility bills with strangers, fights over fridge space, and drags herself out of bed to serve lattes to people she used to think were beneath her. Her social media, once a glossy parade of living my best life, has withered into vague, passive-aggressive quotes about betrayal, toxic men, and lessons learned too late, which is ironic considering the only toxic influence in her life had been her own entitlement. Her followers drifted away when the aspirational content dried up. People don't stick around for bitterness masquerading as empowerment. The last time I actually saw her in person was a few months back, and the encounter sealed everything for me. I was at a nice restaurant with clients, celebrating a contract, when she appeared at our table as the waitress. For a split second, our eyes locked, and I watched her face drain of color as recognition hit. She mumbled something to the manager, disappeared into the back, and a new server came to take over. My clients didn't notice a thing, but I did. That moment wasn't about gloating or triumph. It was about closure, about seeing the end of a story that had already played itself out. She had once told me to be a man, as if the word meant nothing more than emptying my bank account for her comfort. And in the end, that's exactly what I did. I was a man in the truest sense, not by screaming, not by threatening, but by protecting what I had built, providing for myself, and withdrawing my support from someone who saw it as entitlement instead of partnership. My revenge wasn't a single explosion. It wasn't some dramatic public scene. It was slow, methodical, practical, and devastating in its simplicity. I just took her at her word. She wanted to be independent, so I made her independent. She wanted me to provide, so I provided for myself. She wanted to sneer at responsibility as if it were beneath her, so I stripped away every cushion that had shielded her from it. And in that void, she finally learned a lesson that no lecture, no theory, no Instagram rant could ever teach. Reality does not care about your hashtags, your indignation, or your excuses. It cares about rent paid, bills met, food bought, and work done. I didn't ruin Valerie's life. She did that herself. All I did was stop subsidizing her denial. Today, my apartment is not just a home. It's a reminder that boundaries matter, that patience has limits, and that sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't fire and fury, but simply stepping back and letting someone collapse under the weight of the responsibilities they insisted they wanted. When I grill a steak on my balcony now, the smell isn't just dinner, it's freedom, it's dignity, it's the taste of knowing I walked away not as a victim, but as a man who finally remembered that being one doesn't mean carrying someone who refuses to walk beside you.